In the interest of communitarian virtue, why don't you engage more with the secondary literature? And to this indictment, I only have right now a whine. It's too hard. The secondary literature is massive. It's so huge. And I don't know how to proportionately, appropriately assess it all. I've limited myself, to the most part, where, of course, I have to, which is to say, cite any author to whom on whom I have to rely, provide appropriate citation to anyone who's alerted me to some point or alerted me to the importance of some evidence. And second, if someone has treated very carefully a particular passage or a quotation, say, from a governor, I have been able to look those up easily and say the 5 or 7 times someone looks up and has something that is either different or to which I think I need to respond. The second major objection, again in relation to our community as scholars and as Americans, is why are you writing this thing? Why are you writing another grant? This is my big theory on the Privileges or Immunities Clause. 2 years ago, I told everyone, I'm not going to write something like that. We have too many of these great theories. No one agrees. I know what I'm going to write. I'm a uniter, not a divider. I'm going to write something that is a popularly accessible, popular understood as people that, the tiny fraction of the population that are really interested in constitutional history, but that say, this is what the amendment meant, this is what the history was, these are the reasonable interpretations that are given, here's why these people say this, they say that, without saying, oh, by the way, the other side's totally wrong. So in a sense, just to reconnect the American people with their constitutional history in a way that makes them not hate each other more, but like each other more. So they think, well, there's a reason why someone might reach these conclusions, according to the courts and as well as the people. But several things deterred me from that project and led me here. First is, above all, the evidence made me do it. The evidence that I was not aware of, which I saw over and over again, is they don't seem to be bewitched, bothered, or bewildered by the meaning of the amendment. They seem to have a coherent understanding. They say it over and over again. This is not ambiguous. Now, it could be they're protesting too much, but there's at least prima facie evidence of a coherence that many scholars today will say, well, wasn't there. And then I looked at the evidence of incoherence or ambiguity, and I saw that it was limited to opponents, and it was limited in a comprehensible way. Principally the Privileges or Immunities Clause, and principally those 2 issues of whether it's political rights and whether Congress has definitional power. But it was not a kind of broad, crazy indeterminacy. And opponents never, to my knowledge, and I haven't seen it, say to supporters, you guys don't agree with each other, you got crazy notions, you're all over the map. And that was why Chapter 1 is so focused on that, because for me it was important to establish that there's reason to search for a consensus rather than despair of one, because they seem to think they've got one. Again, they may have been mistaken, they may have also been deceiving themselves and others, but I think the evidence primarily points in that direction. There's another evidence of consensus. In trying to map out the areas of agreement and disagreement, not just as to the Privileges or Immunities Clause, but elsewhere, I saw that there are substantial patterns of agreement and disagreement across supporters and opponents. And one of them is the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses, which I try to say legal historians should call them one clause, because most of them treated them as one clause, that there was no substantial disagreement as to the justice or the meaning of those measures. As I indicated, the evidence of opponents saying, love it, awesome, keep it at the states. The main objection was the federalization rather than the meaning. Limited objection as to citizenship, limited interpretive disagreement, more as to privileges or immunities, and substantially more as to enforcement clause. And that's the one I'm still trying to work on because it's the most complicated. Moreover, what led me to believe this was in the course of writing the history of the amendment, I was alerted to what appears to me to be the centrality of the objection and the vulnerability the Republicans had to the objection, that in proposing the amendment, they were confessing that their Civil Rights Act was maybe not, or maybe really wasn't constitutional after all. Now that fact is known to legal historians, but it struck me increasingly that was a major motivator and nearly killed Section 1 and Section 5 of the amendment, in part because some of the radicals said, like Chase, we shouldn't put this in because it's going to ruin it for us. So, and then I read Fessenden's exchange with Doolittle, where Doolittle says something that is commonplace in the House, and Fessenden has a conniption fit that, read in context, is actually very carefully worded. And I said, this guy, he's very eager to say no, 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 but not lie. Because he says, I didn't hear anything about that in the committee. That's because you weren't there. And that's because most of the conversations weren't in the committee. And I said, what if I can use that to try to explain things I've never been able to explain, and that is Howard and Bingham. When I say I've never been able to explain them, I haven't been able to explain them in context of other speakers, nor in their own context, especially Bingham. So talkative until the veto. And he votes to override it, but doesn't say a word. And it occurred to me that, again, it's a hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis that served to explain so many little features of different speeches that it occurred to me that Bingham's taking one tactic, which is he's going to shut his mouth. Because anything he says is going to confirm the supposition. Namely, he's going to say, of course it was unconstitutional, I told you that. And of course this amendment is designed to fix that. Isn't it a great amendment? No, shut up, John, his colleagues will say. And for Howard, it's more complicated, but his speech is, I used to say, I'm tired of dealing with this guy, I can't understand him. He says lots of stuff, but then Andrew Hyman recently discovered his prepared notes, and the prepared notes indicate a lot of thought. They also indicate stages of his note development. And it occurred to me that maybe most of the details I'm having difficulty with can be best explained by someone very carefully trying not to say on behalf of the committee that the Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional, and that's why we're drafting this thing. And I go into the details of how the little details seem to fit into that pattern. If that's the case, that allows me to then make sense more of the evidence and to proceed finally to the conclusions I have about the coherent meaning of the Privileges or Immunities Clause. How many minutes do I have? Am I done?
30 seconds.
I will try to make it 30. First, this summary that I sent you, I asked you just to believe me that each one of these assertions does have some evidence to support it. That is, say, specific people talking about in this way. And it's an effort to try to take all of these things together and make them, the text make sense, the general principles, and the specific applications. And why I say taking American citizenship seriously is, I think if we focus on what does it mean to be a member of the American Republic, then it makes sense that participating in the territory, the markets, and the deliberations of the community, including petitions, including presenting evidence in criminal cases, these things that are mentioned in different places, all seem to make sense. And why religion, I think, is both religion clauses are probably excluded from the Privileges or Immunities Clause. Another area is how do we make sense of the race discrimination and other unfair, unjust. I've always taught it's race and other arbitrary. What do you mean by that? Well, similarly arbitrary. And I couldn't go further than that. But when I started thinking about the definitions of who gets to be in the community, I say, what do naturalization and natural-born laws say? They're very interested in where you're born, who your parents are, what you believe, if it's naturalization, what you don't believe, where you live, how long you've lived there. And those seem to be the type of things that they mention as arbitrary or unjust. Not because there's not other forms of injustices. You can have outrageously unjust age discrimination, or outrageously unjust sex discrimination, or all types of other forms of just stupid laws. But I don't believe the Privileges or Immunities Clause addresses those type of problems. They address the problem of treating an insider like an outsider. If that makes any sense.